Welcome to the Undragoned podcast, focusing on fortifying the people of God and slaying dragons.
Okay, episode 16 of Undragoned. For this one, I have C.R. Wiley. He is a pastor and author, and we're going to be talking about one of his new books that's coming out next month, as well as another one that he's published. But first off, Chris, thank you so much for being on the pod.
Well, Aaron, thanks for having me on. I'm glad to be with you.
Yeah, so that new book that you're coming out with next month is called In the House of Tom Bombadil. That name might ring a bell for listeners or might not. Tom Bombadil, he was a character in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy, and he was a subject of, and still is the subject of, much debate, particularly just because of how interesting and how enigmatic he is. And I think that's part of the reason why you wrote a book on him. And if the name is unfamiliar, but you've watched Lord of the Rings films, just know he wasn't in the movie. That's why he might be unfamiliar to you. But maybe let's start here, Chris. Why write a book on Tom Bombadil?
Well, I've always been fascinated by him, and I like the character. And the more I grew in my appreciation for what the Inklings in general and Tolkien in particular were up to, I grew in my understanding of what I think what kind of purpose Bombadil served in the Lord of the Rings itself. And so I was, kind of startled when I did a little poking around and discovered that there had not been a book written about Tom Bombadil, something, dedicated to him. At least I couldn't find anything. And those two things combined to inspire me. It also, the book, sort of the subject matter and the character, I thought helped me to get into some things that in my writing on households I had not gotten into up to this point. So in a way, this is a book about, Tom Bombadil and the Lord of the Rings. In another way, it's kind of the third installment in my series of books on household. So, first I wrote Man of the House, then I wrote Household and War for the Cosmos, and now I've got In the House of Tom Bombadil. I don't know if I'll continue to write on that theme. If perhaps there's something that will come up that I feel like I need to address, and I can't think about what it might be at the moment. But anyway, at this point, I think I'm pretty much done with the writing on the household, but we'll see. But the book on Bombadil ties into that series.
Such an interesting lens to explore, talking about the household in the eyes of Tom Bombadil, because when we first meet him, he's a pretty eccentric fellow, might be a fair way to say it. I mean, he saves Merry and Pippin from Old Man Willow,
right,
who was swallowing them whole, and he saves them by talking to them, and then he welcomes the four hobbits into his home, and yeah, it's just an interesting way to think about that, especially if, like me, you were introduced to the films first before the books. I watched Fellowship of the Ring before reading the books, and when I did go through Fellowship of the Ring and comparing it to the film, I'm like, oh, this is a interesting side story when they got to Tom Bombadil in the Old Forest. And I guess maybe let's go there. So Peter Jackson, he omitted Tom's story, which only helped spark the controversy regarding or surrounding Tom. So let's talk about Tom being controversial. Why is he such a controversial character?
Well, I think there are a number of people who just find him annoying. There are people who love him, and then there are people who just hate him. I think the people who dislike him don't have a taste for for his songs or, his, I guess, sort of ridiculous appearance. He's described as having a bright blue jacket and yellow boots and a face that is as red as an apple, because of the, I guess, just the ruddy complexion. But so there are a number of them, like an unnecessary sort of side note or detour in the course of the story. So if you're looking for a story that just kind of has a kind of bullet-like or rifle-like character where you're just kind of, rushing to the end, this detour seems to be a waste of time. And I think that's what Peter Jackson concluded. If he didn't think that, then he at least felt like Bombadil was expendable. Now, I'm actually glad and gratified that Bombadil wasn't in the films, because if he were, then I'd have to address, what I think would likely have been the case, and that is a poor portrayal. But there are a couple of things about Bombadil that I think are worth noting. One is that Bombadil is the oldest character in The Lord of the Rings in more than one way. In the course of the story, Bombadil states that he is the oldest creature in Middle-earth. And then he tells the hobbits that he can actually remember the first acorn and the first raindrop. And then that is actually endorsed by Elrod at the Council of Elrod. Elrod says that, Elrod has seen 3 ages in the history of Middle-earth. And he said that even in the first age, Bombadil, who wasn't known as Bombadil at that time, was older than old. He was known as the fatherless one. So this again, makes him the oldest character within the story, but he's also the oldest character in the sense that he was invented before The Hobbit was written. So there was a poem that Tolkien published in the Oxford, I think it's the Oxford magazine. In 1930, Hobbit was published in 1937. Anyway, the poem in the Adventures of Tom Bombadil was published at least 2 years before The Hobbit was published. And we find now, in the course of the narrative in Lord of the Rings, which wasn't published to the mid-50s, Bombadil kind of inserted at the beginning of the story. So in a way, you could say that he feels like something added in that wasn't necessary to the sort of the narrative arc or the plot of the story. But I think that there's a whole lot more going on in the story itself. And I think Bombadil actually serves a pretty important function in the story.
For sure. And when I first read Fellowship of the Ring, and Bombadil drops that bomb of, hey, I was here before everything that you see here, this forest, everything. And then we don't really see him again. I could be wrong. But for me, I'm like, wait, he just drops that bomb and kind of walks away. We don't really see him again. And it kind of begs some questions. And that might be why he's still a figure of such high debate today.
Well, Tolkien said that Bombadil was enigmatic on purpose in a personal letter that he wrote to a fan who asked about Bombadil. And then Tolkien said that he actually serves a function in the story. So we have Tolkien's word on it, that Bombadil is enigmatic, but also purposeful. And he actually does crop up again in the story in a way at different points, important points in the story. So there are references to Bombadil later on in Lord of the Rings. The first being when Frodo is at the ford, he's fleeing the Black Riders, and he turns and addresses the riders, and he, says that they should go back to Mordor. He tells them to go back to Mordor, and then they laugh at him and say, well, why don't you come with us? And at that point in the narrative, Tolkien says, Frodo's words, or Frodo's words didn't have the power of Bombadil's words. That's an important point. Later on, further on in the story, Sam finds himself in Shelob's lair. He's alone. He's scared to death. And he says to himself, I wish Tom were here. So, of course, Frodo and Sam had witnessed Bombadil's power. Bombadil delivers them twice when they're in the Old Forest. But then there are two other very important references to Bombadil in the story. At the very end, before the hobbits get back to the Shire, Gandalf tells them that Saruman is waiting for them there, and that they're going to have to get him out. And they say, well, you're going to come with us, right? And he says, no, I'm not coming with you. My time is done. I've done my job. It's time for you to do what you need to do. And then they ask him, well, where are you going to go? And he says, well, I'm going to have a long talk with Bombadil. So he, at this point in the story, no longer has a mission to serve. He's really in Bombadil's spot, you could say. And he's going into retirement, and he's going to talk to Bombadil, presumably, about what it means to just enjoy being, surrounded by this marvelous world, Middle Earth and so forth. And then at the very end, when Frodo is going into the uttermost west, he's on the ship, departs from the Grey Havens. There's this marvelous transition where he's in a rainstorm, and then the rainstorm becomes like a curtain, a silver curtain, and then parts, and he sees the undying lands of the uttermost west. And he remembers that he dreamed that in Bombadil's house. So there's a tie-in at this point. The very end of the story ties into his time in Bombadil's house. And I actually think then, in one respect, that's how Bombadil functions in the story. He's sort of a picture of the happy ending, but he's introduced at the beginning. So it's a foreshadowing of how, Frodo and Gandalf, when they enter into their final rest, will enjoy the rest that Bombadil already is enjoying early in the story.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I hadn't picked up on a lot of the stuff that you said, especially the part about the Grey Havens. I'm currently rereading Lord of the Rings, and I'm currently in the middle of the Two Towers, and so I'll make sure to kind of stop and pause and look for those hints, allusions, foreshadows revolving around Tom. But coming back to when we first met Tom in Fellowship, and of course he saves the hobbits, brings them to his home, and then they meet his equally enigmatic wife, Goldberry, right?
Right.
And we can kind of see their dynamic. And so I have a question for you. As you're such an important voice on recapturing the importance of the household, the family, what can we learn from Tom about managing a household based off his treatment and dynamic with Goldberry and just all of that?
Yeah, there are a number of things about their relationship that are fascinating and fun to reflect on. If you are familiar with the poem in The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, you're actually introduced to the various characters that you meet in Lord of the Rings in the poem. One of those characters, of course, is Goldberry, but this is before they're married. So in The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, Old Man Willow, the Barrow Wight, there's a character that's a badger, and then there's Goldberry, and each of them try to catch Tom, and none of them are able to. And what you have in the poem is that Tom is at the Withywindle. This is the river that runs through the Old Forest. That Goldberry she's referred to as the River Woman's daughter. So she's connected to the river, and as Tom is leaning over the water and looking down into the depths, Goldberry reaches up and grabs his beard and pulls him in. So he gets dunked, and then she grabs his hat and swims away. Very flirtatious move, and Tom pursues her, gets his hat back, and she's actually trying to get him to go down into this part of the bed of the river where she lives presumably with the river woman. And Tom says, no, I'm not going to live there with you. But later on in the poem, he catches her and takes her home. And she becomes his wife. Now, what's intriguing about all that, beside the fact that this, I think, is a kind of a picture of pursuit and capture in a kind of flirtatious mode that maybe we would associate with an earlier time. Today, we think in terms of, men and women, I don't know, encountering each other on Tinder or in a singles bar or something like that. But in the past, there would be kind of a pursuit and chase, and that was part of the fun of the romantic, sort of encounter that a man and woman would enjoy. And you have that dynamic in the story, but there's also a kind of a tie-in that you only learn about if you do some research on water spirits and water fae in folklore. And one of the things that you see is that definitely in one case, but perhaps more case in other cases, if you could catch a water fae, she had to become your wife. So this is something that Tolkien is playing with in this story. So who is Goldberry? Who is Tom? People, spend a lot of time debating that matter. And what they tend to do is they tend to go to the legendarium, the big backstory, the Silmarillion, and all the other books that were published after Tolkien died, that were edited by his son Christopher, to try to find some kind of backstory to Bombadil. And they're frustrated because they can't find it. This is the oldest character in Middle-earth, and he has no backstory. There's nothing there. But if you're open to the idea that Tolkien is bringing Tom into the story from outside, and that actually, some of the things that I think Tolkien is up to with the characters have to do with kind of the tradition of folklore in Europe, and he's bringing them into the story from that angle. Then I think you can see some things in Tom and Goldberry pretty clearly. But there are lots of other things that Tolkien is up to, and a lot of the things that he's using Tom to sort of flesh out in the story have to do with various debates and controversies in the history of Western thought. So if you have that in mind when you get into the story, if you know what some of those things are and some of the things that were really very interesting to Tolkien at the level of philosophy or theology or even politics, you can see there's some things that he's doing with Tom that tie into all those things.
Wow, yeah, that's super interesting. Okay, before we transition over to households, I have one more question for you. It's a fun one. So, when Tom makes his entrance, we hear him singing the "Hey Doll, Merry Doll," that little tune. So, what's the melody? What do you hear when you read those words?
I'm not a musical guy, so I just kind of whatever kind of comes along for me. Now, somebody who is musical would probably be able to put his song to music and make it sound good. I just mumble and bumble my way along, trying to do it.
Seeing as how I'm the exact same way, I cannot fault you there, brother. Well, that was super fascinating. And if you've been listening to this and you have not read Lord of the Rings, guys, what are you doing? You need to read Lord of the Rings. There's so much depth to it. Chris, his book is just tapping into one aspect of Tolkien's world. There's so much more to it. And I'm really glad that Chris is exploring Tom Bombadil. A much needed book, in my opinion. And that book is set to come out December 14th, correct?
That's the hope. There are some supply chain troubles that everybody's experiencing. And I know that the folks at Canon Press are hoping and praying that the delivery arrives in time. So because it's being published in hardback, Canon Press is fully capable of producing paperback books, but they don't have the equipment to produce hardback books, and they decided to publish this in hardcover, which I'm glad for. But it means that they had to, sort of shop the job around and get another printer to print the book for them. So they're hoping that it arrives in time.
Well, we definitely hope that gets out on time for sure. Yeah. Well, let's move on to your other book that was published before Bombadil. It's called The Household and the War for the Cosmos. I read it a few weeks ago, and I thought it was just fantastic. And in the book, you first get into etymology. You talk about the word piety, which we'll need to flesh out. And you dropped this very interesting term called guerrilla piety. Not the animal gorilla, but guerrilla as in kind of like guerrilla warfare. And that was something that you returned to over and over in your book. And so I thought it'd be helpful for our listeners to first start with a working definition of guerrilla piety. So what is guerrilla piety?
Right. Well, there are two things that would be helpful for folks to know in terms of those words, guerrilla and piety. Obviously, when we think of guerrilla warfare, we're thinking of, warfare that's conducted by unconventional means. You've got a bunch of guys living in the hills and, making, daring, raids against, a much better equipped, much more powerful foe. So guerrilla tactics are sort of asymmetrical and clandestine in terms of how they how the guerrilla warfare is prosecuted. Now, the word piety, though, you got into that a little bit. I think that's worth getting into a bit, because I think for most people, when they hear the word piety, they tend to think of maybe their grandma on the front porch reading her Bible or something like that. And for a lot of folks, piety is kind of an inward disposition and something that actually withdraws from the world. But in antiquity, pius, the Latin word that we derived the English word piety from, referred to a more social virtue that was exercised not just with divine beings, toward divine beings, but even toward, your benefactors were human beings. So the benefactors that we all, owe a great deal to, because if it weren't for them, we wouldn't be here, our parents, mothers and fathers. So there's filial piety, which is the kind of dutiful return that a child should make toward his or her parents. And so in antiquity, particularly in the empire, the Roman Empire, this was strongly encouraged because they didn't have the kind of social safety nets that we take for granted today. There was no Social Security. There was no, child welfare services. There was nothing, out there to take care of people when they were in need beside households. And so that meant that households had to fulfill a very important function in society with regard to a whole range of things, but in particular, in this case, what we would refer to as sort of social welfare services. And because that was the case, the civil authorities strongly encouraged children to care for parents, parents to care for children. And this also kind of tied into the religious life of the empire. So if you are making a return to those who have been your beneficiaries, you begin with your parents, but you don't end there. This is expressed to the civil authorities, people who are responsible for the care of the social sort of world that you live in, and then ultimately to the gods or to God. So that all implies that there's a kind of cosmic order within which your dutiful service is being rendered. Now, when you take these two things together and you put them together, guerrilla piety then is something that is practiced by people who have a religious system or a cosmology that is at odds with the cosmology of the sort of the status quo. So within the empire, for example, while you still have the due regard that you should have for your parents, when it comes to the status of the emperor, for example, with regard to Christians, this is a problem, because within sort of classical Roman society, he was understood, the emperor, to be a divine being, human and divine, a son of God. And there are, we actually have artifacts from the 1st century in which we see Augustus Caesar seated in heavenly places with the gods. He's surrounded by Neptune and Athena and others. And what that intends to imply, of course, is that he's seated in heavenly places. Consequently, he has divine authority. Christians naturally don't agree. Christians believe that Christ is seated in heavenly places, and those other fellows, those other people that their neighbors thought also occupied heavenly places, they're not there. There's no Neptune up there. There's no Athena up there. It's just the Lord Jesus Christ. So guerrilla piety then was the practice of worshiping the true God in Christ, and doing so in such a way that you are actually subverting the dominant cosmological understanding of your neighbors. So you're at war. There is a spiritual war that's going on, and Christians believe that there are spiritual forces that are actually at work that are demonic. And this is where we see Paul in Ephesians refer to the prince of the power of the air. It was understood that there was this intervening space between earth and the highest heavenly places that was occupied by demonic forces, and these demonic forces were kind of masquerading as divine powers, and were calling for worship and reverence and respect and so forth. And of course, Christians couldn't bring themselves to do those things, because they believe that there's only one mediator between God and man, the Lord Christ Jesus. And so their piety, the piety of those Christians, was guerrilla in that character, in the sense that they were, in a spiritual conflict against a very intimidating foe that on the ground, if we were just to look at the physical resources, completely outgunned the early church, But when it came to the spiritual realities that were being recognized by the Christians, they knew that they were worshiping the true God and that their neighbors were worshiping demons. So all of that is in the background when I use the term guerrilla piety. So when Christians practice, sort of the patterns of life that the Apostle Paul lays out in the household codes in Colossians and Ephesians, he's calling them to live out their piety in a way that honors Christ. If that makes sense.
Oh, it definitely makes sense. And thank you so much for the background on the word. I mean, pious, it does have somewhat of a negative connotation in today's context, where it's just kind of focused inwardly. But as you mentioned, it had more of a social aspect with its original usage, a public aspect. And fast forward to today, I mean, yes, there was the early church, and they practiced their piety, and the Lord honored that and grew the church. And of course, the church is a lot larger today than when it first started in the 1st century. But fast forward to today, we seem to be in a fairly similar situation. I mean, our lives aren't in jeopardy. And I'm talking about the Western Church here.
Right.
But we're in the minority, and things look grim at times. And so, in the context of the household, how can Christian families take hold and practice guerrilla piety?
Right. Well, just like those Romans in the empire had a cosmos that they inhabited, and that cosmos informed their whole way of thinking about households and themselves and everything in their society. We today have an image of the cosmos that informs us. The cosmos that informs our thinking today is a sort of materialistic way of thinking about the cosmos, or it reflects a materialistic way of thinking about the cosmos, in which it's just matter and energy, and that there's no real sort of inherent meaning in anything. So for example, when people, take it upon themselves to transition in terms of their gender, what they're in a sense saying is that there's no given meaning to the sexual, sort of status I have as a man or a woman. I can do whatever I want. I'm the one who provides the meaning. The world that we live in is a meaningless place. And since that's the case in their minds, no one has any right to tell anybody else what things mean. There's no sort of interpretation of meaning at the largest level. There's just, you got your meaning, I've got my meaning. So we live in a world of subjectivity, and a world that doesn't have any sort of objective standards of meaning. But that is the cosmos we live in. We have a way of thinking about the cosmos that leaves us to ourselves, you could say. But that's not the way things truly are. So even though the cosmos that we live in is very different, or say, I should say, the cosmos that our contemporary fellow citizens live in, and the way they think about things is very different than the one that the people saw themselves living in the empire. Even though there's a tremendous difference, there's still a sense in which we're out of sync with, or out of accord with, the way that the cosmos is understood today. Now, most people don't think in these terms. Most people just sort of like operate from a kind of a gut level. But if people really did believe that we lived in a meaningful universe, that everything that we see around us was brought into being and ordered by a creator, the thing that they would not be doing is what we see people doing all around us, which is making stuff up as they go along. What they would really be interested in discovering is, what does it all mean? They'd realize that the meaning is out there, and that they need to get in touch with that meaning in order to be happy. But because that's not the case, because it's assumed that we just live in this vast sort of mechanism that has no creator, then we're the only ones that give meaning to things. So that's the problem we face today. And so I think that we still have a very challenging task of engaging in guerrilla piety. What we face, though, today is the challenge of helping our non-Christian interlocutors see that there is a creator, and that the world that he made for us to dwell in is a meaningful place and a good thing. So if we can help them see that, then we can help them kind of get out of their sort of their heads and their subjectivity, and get in touch with reality.
Yeah, that's good. So what would the direct relation be with the household then? Or how does the household fit into this equation?
Yeah, I think that in every sort of cosmology, there is a way that a household gets ordered. So, for example, in antiquity, within the empire, there was a way that people understood the cosmos to work, and that was reflected in the households that Roman pagans established. Likewise, when Christians established their households, it reflected the biblical understanding of the relationship between God and creation and so forth. So let's just take a look at what we see in Ephesians. There we see in Ephesians that in a Christian household, husbands and wives have roles. The husband is to model his behavior and his leadership in a household on Christ, and a wife is to model her relationship to her husband on the church. So that's the framework. So the cosmos is a cosmos in which Christ and the church are understood to be relating to each other within this larger, sort of sphere of meaning. Now, today, because there's nothing like this, because things have been radically flattened, there's no hierarchy. What we end up with is just kind of personal relationships and everybody kind of negotiating their way through life, trying to get as much as they can out of the relationship while giving as little as they can, afford to give or are forced to give. So you end up with a much more sort of, I think, antagonistic relationship between husbands and wives, almost competitive in nature, as opposed to the Christian understanding of a husband and wife becoming one flesh, and having a set of common interests, a common future, common wealth, a common life. Today, what we end up with is just a couple of people cohabitating and maybe going on vacation every once in a while together. They've got separate careers, they got separate bank accounts, they got, they're just basically there for the recreational hours to keep each other company. That's a kind of, I think, pretty bald way of putting it, but I think it's the way people really think.
I think what's undergirding a lot of what you're saying is that people just aren't willing to submit. I mean, God has an order for the cosmos, an order for the household, as you talked about. People just aren't willing to submit to his law, submit to his word. And you had a really good quote in the book here that I'm going to read on submission, pulling from Ephesians 6, the household code they were talking about. So here's what it says. Understood in the right way, a submission is something to be proud of. Just think of the command, attack, and the valor we admire when men rise in obedience to charge. This brings up the real problem people have with the household codes. They don't believe that the sacrifices they call for are worth making. They don't believe the households serve a higher purpose than the personal goals of the individuals that live in them. Close quote. And so, to your point, when people don't submit to God and his word and they follow after themselves, then relationships become antagonistic. Relationships become vitriolic, combustible. And so I think your book here is just so important that we should recapture the household. We should recapture the idea of submission, of hierarchy, words like that.
Yeah. Well, this actually brings me back to Bombadil, believe it or not. So, in The Lord of the Rings, when Frodo is puzzled as to what Bombadil is, who is this person or thing or creature? He initially asks Goldberry, who is Tom Bombadil? And her response is, he is the master. And Frodo is puzzled. He says, do you mean that this whole land, belongs to him? And then she's puzzled that he makes that connection. She says, no, all the trees and the grass and everything belongs to itself, but Tom is the master. So what we see in Goldberry's statements is that for her, mastery and domination are not the same thing. What you have when we think about dominion, dominion is something that, Adam and Eve are told to exercise in creation. And then what we do as fallen creatures is we interpret that in a fallen way. for us, what comes to mind for us when we hear the word dominion is ownership and control. But that's not necessarily what we should think of. What we I think should think of, I think, is marvelously embodied by Bombadil. So that was actually one of the reasons I wanted to explore the character of Tom Bombadil, because he embodies a way of practicing dominion that does not humiliate or harm those who are subject to him. In fact, I don't, when you read Goldberry's statements about Tom, they don't contain even the slightest bit of resentment, envy, competitive spirit, any of that. She loves Tom, she admires Tom, she respects Tom. Tom is not a threat to her. Tom is someone who is, you see it a couple times in the course of the story. Tom, when he exercises his dominion, he frees the hobbits. He frees them from Old Man Willow, the tree, and then later he frees them from their captivity with the Bear White. So Tom is, I think, a marvelous picture of what dominion can look like, and really, I think, ought to look like.
Man, that's just so good, and I'm so glad that we're able to return to Bombadil and kind of tie this conversation up in a nice, neat little bow. And so, Chris, thank you so much for coming on the pod. For our listeners, make sure to pre-order In the House of Tom Bombadil, coming out December 14th, and buy Chris's earlier stuff, Household and the War for the Cosmos, which we talked about today. His other book, Man of the House. I think he also has a children's novel out as well. But Chris, before you go, tell us where we can find you.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Aaron. I enjoyed my conversation with you. And if people want to, follow things that I'm up to, they can just go to crwiley.com.